He had no idea the woman he insulted was the very force about to dismantle his entire department, with nothing but a single sentence. "I'll see you in court." It was early autumn in Atlanta, Georgia. The air carried a quiet chill as Imani Reed, a 39-year-old civil rights attorney known for toppling corrupt institutions, drove home after a long day representing a woman assaulted behind bars. Imani had built her career on calm precision, not outrage. But that day, something shifted. As she merged onto Peachtree Avenue in her silver hybrid, flashing lights flared behind her. No violation, no reason, just a white officer with a badge and a bias. When she calmly said she was a lawyer, his laugh was sharp and dismissive. "You," he sneered, "you're nobody." That word didn't spark an argument, it triggered a movement. And by the time she was finished, the entire city would remember exactly who Imani Reed was. The late afternoon light in suburban Atlanta draped the neighborhood in a faded gold, the kind that made shadows stretch long across cracked sidewalks and parked cars. Inside her silver sedan, Imani Reed adjusted the volume of the jazz playing softly from the speakers. A Coltrane classic her mother used to play on rainy Sundays. She had just left Fulton County Courthouse after a brutal deposition representing a Latina woman who had suffered sexual assault while in custody. Imani, 39, was composed as always. Crisp white blouse, pale gray slacks, a thin silk scarf knotted neatly at her throat. Her appearance was as deliberate as her speech. Calm, clean, undeniable. She wasn't flashy, but every inch of her signaled power that didn't need to announce itself. As she turned onto a quieter stretch of Oak Hill Avenue, a police cruiser suddenly slid in behind her. No sirens, no lights, just presence. Imani checked her mirrors and, on instinct, flipped her signal to pull over before she was even asked. The cruiser crept up behind her, engine humming low. She rolled down her window halfway and placed her license and registration on the dashboard, then rested her hands gently on the wheel. Her heart rate didn't spike. It never did. She had trained herself too well for that. The door creaked open behind her, boots hitting pavement with a measured stomp. She caught a glimpse in the side mirror. White male, late 40s, stocky, slow-moving but certain. Officer Nate Halbrook. She didn't know him, but she knew the type. He didn't greet her, didn't explain the stop. Instead, he leaned in through the open window, breath heavy with old coffee and entitlement. His eyes scanned the dashboard before settling on her face. "You seem a little dressed up for this part of town," he said flatly. His voice wasn't angry, just amused, like her presence on that road was the setup to a joke only he understood. Imani turned to meet his gaze, her voice even. "Is there a reason I'm being stopped, officer?" Halbrook smirked and ignored the question. "What do you do for a living?" "I'm an attorney," she answered. That word, attorney, did something to his expression. Not surprise, not disbelief, just irritation, the kind that suggested he'd already decided who she was, and the title didn't fit his narrative. "You," he repeated with a short laugh. "A lawyer?" He studied her ID like it might change if he stared hard enough. "Come on, you people always got stories, always pretending to be somebody." The pause after his words was sharp and intentional, and then he said it, without a raised voice, without heat, just a cold certainty. "You're nobody." The words hit the air like static, uncomfortable but familiar. Imani didn't flinch. She had heard worse, endured worse, but something in his tone made it stick. It wasn't just a personal insult, it was a verdict. The kind handed down by men like him 1,000 times before. No ticket was issued, no warning given. After a few more moments of unnecessary stalling, Halbrook tossed her ID onto the passenger seat with a flick of his wrist and said simply, "Watch yourself." Then he walked back to his cruiser like the conversation never happened. Imani sat in the silence that followed, the engine still humming, her hands still resting on the wheel. The jazz had stopped playing. The only sound now was the blood moving through her ears, slow and deliberate. She didn't scream. She didn't chase. She reached for her phone and took a photo of the rearview mirror, capturing the patrol car's number. Her fingers were steady. Her eyes were sharper than they had been all day, because that officer didn't know it yet, but he had just given her exactly what she needed. Not a reason to be angry, a reason to act, Officer Halbrook held Imani's ID far longer than protocol required, flipping it between his fingers like it was some kind of joke. He didn't ask the usual questions. Instead, he leaned farther into the open window, letting his eyes sweep slowly across her car interior. Briefcase in the passenger seat, a half-full coffee thermos, a pair of reading glasses resting on the dashboard. "Busy day?" he asked, voice dry. "Where are we headed? Important meeting? Court date?" His tone wasn't curious. It was performative, like he wanted an audience. When Imani replied calmly that she was heading home after a deposition, he raised his brows and scoffed. "Bet you talk a good game in there," he muttered. Then his gaze drifted to her braided hair. "You tie those yourself, or is that part of the whole act?" The insult didn't sting. It was too predictable for that. But it was calculated, the kind that comes from someone used to holding power over people like her. When she didn't react, he circled the vehicle, tapping lightly on the back windows, then crouched beside the passenger side, peering in again like he might find something, anything, to justify what was quickly becoming an unlawful stop. Imani knew her rights. She'd argued them in court. So when he told her to step out of the car, she didn't move. "Are you detaining me?" she asked. "Do you have a reason to search my vehicle?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked back to his cruiser and spoke into his shoulder mic, tone low and measured. Within minutes, two more patrol cars rolled up, parking diagonally across the quiet suburban street. Neighbors peered out from behind curtains. A jogger stopped mid-stride, and someone with a phone, started recording. It was a soft detainment, the kind that doesn't make the evening news unless someone bleeds. The officers didn't drag her out, didn't raise their weapons, but the presence of three cruisers surrounding one black woman alone in a car said everything. One of them hovered near her back window, hand resting a little too close to his holster. Another shined a flashlight directly into her face despite the daylight. Halbrook returned after several long minutes, still holding her ID, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You think you're something special, don't you?" he asked. "Driving through neighborhoods like this in your little lawyering outfit?" He leaned his forearm on the roof of her car, looked down at her like he was daring her to speak. "You want to know the truth?" he said, voice lowering just enough to feel personal. "I should take you back to where you really belong." His words weren't loud, but they cut, sharp, precise, and deliberately meant to degrade. Not just her profession, not just her presence, but her identity. Still, Imani didn't break. She didn't give him the satisfaction of outrage. Instead, she looked him in the eye and asked plainly, "What's your name, officer?" Halbrook leaned back with exaggerated confidence. "Officer Nate Halbrook," he said, puffing his chest. "Why? You're going to write me up?" Imani gave the faintest smile, the kind that isn't about amusement but clarity. "No," she said quietly. "I'm going to sue the institution that trained you to think this was acceptable." Her voice didn't shake. Her hands didn't move. But at that moment, the shift was seismic. Halbrook's grin faltered just slightly. He tossed her ID onto the seat and walked off without another word, not knowing that the footage taken by that jogger, and the woman he'd just tried to diminish, would soon ignite something far bigger than he could imagine. The moment Imani walked through the door of her home, she didn't head to the kitchen or change out of her court attire. She didn't even sit down. Instead, she grabbed her phone, called her assistant Jordan, and said firmly, "Cancel everything for the next 5 days. I have something to write." She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. The moment in that car, the words, the smirk, the quiet threat, had ignited something in her that wasn't anger. It was for a purpose. That night, she spread open her laptop on the dining table, the same place where she once studied for the bar exam, with a broken heater and a borrowed Wi-Fi signal. But this time, it wasn't about survival. It was about building a case strong enough to shake the ground beneath a broken system. Her first call was to a data scientist she'd worked with on a prior housing discrimination lawsuit. She needed 5 years of Atlanta Police Department traffic stop records, names, times, locations, reasons given, outcomes, race of the person stopped. Next, she began compiling a list of previous clients, community members, and referrals. Black residents who had experienced unjustified stops but had been told, "There's no case." This time, there would be a case. Imani began organizing community listening sessions, small at first, in rec centers, church basements, coffee shops that stayed open past closing time for her cause. She didn't promise miracles. She promised documentation. What she needed wasn't outrage. It was receipts. By the third day, her living room looked like a war room, files stacked against the walls, a whiteboard filled with timelines and officer names. And then came the knock at her door. Jordan stood there, not with coffee or questions, but with someone else, Detective Tasha Monroe. A black woman in her mid-40s with tired eyes and a reputation that had once been spotless until she crossed the wrong lines. Tasha had served in internal affairs for almost a decade before being quietly reassigned to evidence storage after filing 3 separate reports about Nate Halbrook's misconduct. None had been pursued. All had been administratively resolved. Imani invited her in without hesitation. They sat down at the kitchen table, no small talk. Tasha opened a plain manila folder and began laying out copies of internal memos, email chains, and officer complaint forms, some marked confidential, others simply forgotten. "They knew," she said quietly. "The department knew what he was doing, not just to you, to others. I filed it, I fought it, and they buried it." Imani listened, her pen not moving, her eyes never leaving Tasha's face. When Tasha finished speaking, there was silence between them. Not awkward, but sacred. A silent agreement formed in that stillness. Tasha would help. She wouldn't testify yet, but she'd provide what they needed to prove that Halbrook wasn't a rogue actor. He was a symptom of a system that protected his kind of policing. Imani thanked her and added her name to the growing list of voices that had once been ignored. With each night, the network grew. Young men, elderly women, teachers, nurses, students, each one bringing a story, a report, a memory. The picture was coming together. A culture of profiling, cloaked in policy, upheld by silence. Imani wasn't building a lawsuit. She was assembling an indictment, on paper, in data, in the faces of every person who had been pulled over, not because they were speeding, but because they were black. And Halbrook? He wasn't her target. He was just her entry point. When the lawsuit was filed, Reed v. Atlanta Police Department, demanding $500 million in damages and a full structural overhaul, the city didn't just pause. It erupted. Within hours, news outlets picked it up like wildfire. And by the end of the day, the clip of Officer Halbrook sneering, "You're nobody," had become a viral anthem of resistance on TikTok, Twitter, and across national headlines. Hashtags surged. Number Imani Reed, number You're Nobody, number Reform Now. The footage, recorded by a jogger who'd instinctively started filming that day on Oak Hill Avenue, struck a nerve far beyond Atlanta. It wasn't just the words. It was the way he said them. The smirk, the posture, the entitlement. It became a meme, a cautionary tale, and a rallying cry all at once. Under pressure, the Atlanta Police Department scrambled. A hastily arranged press conference featured a visibly uncomfortable deputy chief offering a vague statement about integrity and thorough internal review. Halbrook was placed on administrative leave, pending investigation. Yet even off duty, he couldn't help himself. In an interview with a local conservative radio station, he dismissed the lawsuit as an overreaction and referred to Imani as a woman playing victim for likes. The arrogance of his tone only fanned the flames. Commentators on both sides of the political aisle weighed in, but public opinion was already tilting hard in Imani's favor, because she wasn't speaking from pain alone. She was speaking from proof. Behind the scenes, Imani and her legal team kept working. Then came the break no one expected. Buried within the department's archived financial records, unredacted city budget data, cross-referenced with legal settlements, Imani's paralegal found something explosive. In 2018, the department had quietly paid out $120,000 to settle a civil claim involving none other than Nate Halbrook. The complaint had alleged that Halbrook used excessive force against a 19-year-old black college student during a routine stop. The case never made it to court. No press release, no disciplinary record, just a check cut from the city's Incident Response Fund and a non-disclosure agreement filed away. Imani had seen plenty of hush money before, but this wasn't just a payout. It was a paper trail leading straight to the top. She verified it with a second source, then brought it to Naomi Ellis, an investigative journalist known for chasing stories others wouldn't touch. Within 36 hours, Ellis dropped a front-page expose detailing the buried settlement, the department's failure to discipline Halbrook, and the pattern of racial bias that had persisted for over a decade. The article hit the city like a thunderclap. Council members who had stayed silent began issuing statements. Community groups organized marches outside City Hall. Protesters carried signs quoting Halbrook's own words, turned against him. "You're nobody? We are everybody." City officials, cornered by both media scrutiny and rising public anger, called an emergency session to discuss the lawsuit and police oversight. The mayor's office issued a statement calling the revelations deeply troubling, while simultaneously attempting to distance itself from the department's leadership. The police union clumsily tried to discredit Imani, accusing her of being politically motivated, but the damage was already done. Every local outlet ran the headline. Halbrook wasn't a lone bad actor. He was a repeat offender, protected by a system that knew what he was and paid to keep him in uniform. And Imani had the receipts. By the end of the week, even longtime political holdouts were calling for reforms, and more whistleblowers were stepping forward. The narrative had shifted. It was no longer about one traffic stop. It was about the rot underneath. And for the first time in years, people weren't just listening. They were ready to act. The courtroom was packed from wall to wall on the morning the trial began. Rows of spectators spilled into the standing room, and the air was heavy with anticipation, not chaos. Just a kind of collective stillness. Like everyone knew something historic was about to unfold. At the front, the plaintiffs sat side by side. A 14-year-old boy who had been forced to strip during a roadside stop, a middle school teacher misidentified and handcuffed in front of her students, an elderly black couple pushed to the curb while walking home from church. None of them spoke, but their presence spoke volumes. Imani Reed stood at the plaintiff's table, poised and steady, a navy blue blazer buttoned with precision, and when the judge gave her the nod, she stepped forward, not to plead, but to reveal. "Your Honor," she began, "the people sitting behind me have names. They have jobs, families, and lives. But when they were pulled over, none of that mattered. What mattered was how they looked, where they lived, and who was wearing the badge." Her voice didn't waver as she moved through her presentation. Pages of internal reports, video footage, city documents, and sworn testimonies. Slide by slide, story by story, she laid bare the system that had protected, enabled, and paid off men like Officer Halbrook. "These individuals," she continued, gesturing to the plaintiffs, "were told they were nobody, but today they are the voice of accountability. Today they are the truth this courtroom can no longer ignore." There was no grandstanding, only clarity. Her closing words rang with weight. "We are not here to take revenge. We are here to take responsibility on behalf of every silent no one who never made it to court." Deliberation lasted just under 8 hours. When the jury returned, the tension in the room felt electric. No one moved. No one dared blink. The foreperson stood and read the verdict in a voice that cracked slightly under the pressure. "In the case of Reed versus Atlanta Police Department, we find in favor of the plaintiffs. We award damages in the amount of $500 million. Gasps filled the room, some sharp, some soft and choked with tears. A pen dropped to the floor. Someone whispered, "She did it." Imani didn't rise. She simply bowed her head, one hand closing gently over the table. It wasn't a relief. It was justice catching up. In the days that followed, the fallout was swift. The chief of police announced his resignation, citing a need for structural change. Officer Nate Halbrook was stripped of his badge and gun within 24 hours and placed under investigation by the state attorney general. No press conference, no farewells. Just silence as he walked out of the precinct for the last time, unescorted and unacknowledged. The city council voted unanimously to establish an independent oversight committee composed of legal experts, educators, clergy, and 3 of the plaintiffs who had testified during the trial. Their task to audit, monitor, and hold accountable a department that had for too long policed without listening. New policies were drafted, training protocols rewritten, But beyond the headlines and reforms, it was the shift in narrative that mattered most. The phrase, "you're nobody," had been used to diminish, to dehumanize. Now it echoed as a reminder. Underestimating the wrong person could cost you your power. Imani never sought attention. She didn't give interviews or accept awards, but in communities across the city, her name became a quiet promise that when the system failed, someone would still stand. Not for revenge, but for reckoning. The image went viral within hours. A quiet, powerful photograph taken from behind, showing Imani Reed standing in front of the Atlanta Police Department headquarters, her posture calm, her gaze fixed on a newly mounted plaque above the entrance. It read in bold bronze letters, "Every citizen deserves dignity." There was no podium, no speech, just her silhouette, framed by the late afternoon sun, a symbol not of victory, but of transformation. The moment didn't need volume, it had weight. Across social media, the image was reposted thousands of times with the caption, "She made the system listen." And that's exactly what she did. Imani didn't respond to injustice with rage or revenge. She responded with precision, with evidence, with unshakable resolve. Her silence in the face of Officer Halbrook's words wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Because when she finally chose to speak, she didn't just defend herself. She defended every person who'd been dismissed, ignored, or told they didn't matter. The lesson she left behind was searing in its clarity. Calling someone a nobody doesn't erase them. It elevates their story into something the world can no longer look away from. She didn't just win a case, she rewrote the rules. She made justice audible. She reminded the city and the country that the most dangerous thing you can do to a black woman with a voice and a vision is underestimate her. Imani had only planned to drive home that evening, but instead she forced an entire institution to hit the brakes and confront itself in the mirror. And for every person who's ever been told they don't belong, her story stands as proof. Your silence isn't a void, it's a choice. And when you choose to break it, you don't just speak, you shift the ground beneath you. If you've ever been overlooked, dismissed, or told you're less than, don't stay silent. Share this story. Because the next time someone calls a person nobody, they just might be talking to the one who's about to change everything.